We're here in Rome, and with us is Alessandro Gisotti, a journalist and communicator for the Vatican, for the Holy See, since the year 2000. Thank you so much for being with us, and of course one of my first questions is the 10th anniversary of Pope Francis. How have you experienced Pope Francis in these years?
Well, you know, as you were saying, Andreas, I've been working now for 23 years, starting in Vatican Radio during the Great Jubilee of 2000. And so I had the privilege to serve the Holy See and the popes, three great pontiffs, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Pope Francis. And each of them gave me something not only on a professional level, but on a personal, spiritual one. And I think that every one of us, yes, of course, every one of us has his style of communication, but they are really great communicators. In particular, Pope Francis, in my opinion, is reminding every day with his words, with his gestures, even more than words, the importance of relation with God, a merciful God, and how this relationship, this friendship with Jesus, with the merciful God, can change our life forever. So I think this is the real core. The most important thing is doing even on a communication level.
What have you learned from him in this regard?
You know, the importance of caring for people. That people are really important when you meet, when you have a meeting, an encounter with every person, and it doesn't matter if it is the head of a state or a poor along the way that you meet. So I think that person is the most important value that is always underlying in every day through his homilies, speeches, and as I already told, especially through gesture, because I think that sometimes we have to admit that he speaks more through gestures, and sometimes these gestures bring a message that is much more powerful than words, and even silence. I remember I was with him in Auschwitz, and this was a journey, an incredible journey, because he decided not to say a word in the Auschwitz camp, and then this silence spoke powerfully on that occasion.
What would you say were the most important messages so far? You mentioned one, but what are we to really take with us from Pope Francis from the last 10 years, really?
That God loves every one of us, the importance of the mercy dimension. We have to remember the special jubilee that Pope Francis celebrated at the beginning of his pontificate. So I think that mercy is really a key word of his pontificate, and from this key word, this principle, we can see all the, I would say, the wonders, also, if I can say, the miracles, like the journey in Africa or in Iraq, always expressing this merciful through the message of the gospel. So I think that this is really something that we have to deepen in our life, this message of a merciful God loving us and really changing our life if we accept to be touched by this love of a merciful God. Because this is something important to me. We are free to refuse or accept this love, but God is always loving us, and Pope Francis is witnessing with his person, with his messages, with his words, with his gestures, that God is always there waiting for us, waiting for us.
He's also a very public figure, of course, as a pope. How would you describe his perception, especially also in the secular media, and what are you missing there? Like, is there maybe an aspect of Pope Francis that is not being reported on so well or so much?
He's a man of prayer. Probably sometimes you call the secular media miss this aspect of a profound spirituality of Pope Francis. I think this is something that we have to understand and to try to, to understand better. Because everything that he does, even those gestures that I have already many times mentioned, always start from the prayer, from the relation with God. The spirituality dimension is always the beginning of the story for Pope Francis. Just think of Syria, just think of Iraq, just think of South Sudan. Always there is at the beginning of this wonderful story that we are seeing with this pontificate, from a prayer, from a moment of profound relation with God and discernment. That is one of the key words of this pontificate, because he's a Jesuit. So discernment is not only a soundbite, it's something very profound in his life before he became Pope, and even more now. So probably I understand that for secular media it's not so easy to understand this part of the spirituality of the pontificate, but it's up to us, the media of the Vatican, the Catholic media, to underline the importance of the spiritual dimension of his life and of his pontificate.
Having worked and observed many popes also before, what would you say is the real impact, or the most important impact of Pope Francis's pontificate?
I think that, as I have already said, every one of these great pontiffs I have the honor, the privilege to serve as its style of communication. And I'm convinced that the Holy Spirit helps the pontiffs to be up to the task. And we understand how now, I speak for the communication side, how social media are so important, especially for the young generation. So I think that Pope Francis, with his capacity, his capacity to generate images, is really up to the task to be a communicator for the social media age. And that is why in the Twitter account Pontifex is followed by more than 50 million people, and the Instagram account Franciscus more or less 10 million people. This is huge. And so I think that this is something new in respect of his predecessor, even if I have to remind that it was Pope Benedict XVI to open the account Twitter Pontifex. So even if he had his age at the time when the Pontifex account started his experience, he really understood the importance to be there, to evangelize in the digital continent, as Benedict XVI underlined in a message for the World Day of Communication. We have to be there. We don't have to be fearful to stay there and to evangelize even in this new continent, because it's really a continent. So if we believe that new evangelization is fundamental for the third millennium and our century, we have to stay there. And I think that there is a wonderful continuity between Benedict XVI and Francis on this particular aspect of communication.
The digital communication is also not a one-way street, but you can communicate, but then you receive also comments and questions back. If you're observing or watching also a little bit of those social media channels, is there something that sticks out, a question maybe that people have for the Pope that comes often? What really impressed me during the pandemic, and so the difficulties of the lockdown and people isolated, especially the elder people, we received many comments and many emails thanking and being grateful to Pope Francis for his homilies, the morning homilies in Casa Santa Marta. And this is quite impressive, because we always say, and maybe this is true, that we live in a situation of secularization and a sort of desertification on a spiritual field. At the same time,
many people, even not only the Catholic faithful, but many people understood how important it was to have the Pope every morning during the lockdown, during that ugly situation for so many million people around the world, to have a word of hope through the gospel. And so I think that this is something that really impressed us a lot, and that convinced us, for example, to start a service in the Dicastery for Communication of sign language, because we understood that many people needed to this translations of the homilies of the Pope and then the speeches, the catechesis, in the sign language. And this is something very important because it shows us how Pope Francis generates good experience. And for example, with this sign language, we understood that really no one has to be left out. If you want that the gospel, the message of gospel through the words of the Pope arrive to all, we have to develop all the tools possible that the technology, thanks God, today gives us.
And the Dicastery of Communication here at the Vatican, you told me also it's more than 40 languages, yeah, and then also sign languages that you're communicating in. What is the greatest challenge there?
You know, I think coordination, because as I was saying, Andreas, I started working in Vatican Radio 23 years ago, the year 2000. And I can assure you that even at that time there was a talk of reforming the Vatican media. Why? Because even at the time we understood the need of better coordination, better synergy between the different Vatican media outputs, the Vatican Radio, the Osservatore Romano, the Publishing House, the Holy See Press Office, and then now Vatican News, because we have now this new brand, the new information website, Vatican News. So I think that the challenge every day really is the coordination and to have a more consistent message. And yes, we have to make some corrections along the way. That's normal. This is a very young story, the one of the Dicastery for Communication, but I think that the principle is valid and useful to have a better coordination, better synergy between the different media with the different story, different format, different languages, as you were saying, and different cultural approach to give more strength to the message, and the message is the gospel, through particularly the words of the Holy Father, the Pope Francis now.
And I have one more question, if you allow me, a more personal one. You have been working, you said also serving the Holy Father, but really collaborating also with him for 10 years now. What will you take with you? What have you learned on a personal level from him?
You know, I've been director ad interim director of the Holy See Press Office in 2019. So that year I had many occasions to meet with Pope Francis, and I have to say that I really have a good memory of these meetings, and even now I have less opportunities to meet him, but it happens every time. Is a moment of joy and consolation for me. So what really impressed me is that when you are with him, it's just you. You really feel that he is listening to you, he cares about you, and even if you know how many things he has to do, how many meetings he has to attend, you have really the feeling that it's you. And I remember that, as you can understand, as you can imagine, when I was the spokesman, Vatican spokesman, and when we had meeting with him, we talked mostly about work, but always the Holy Father always asked me about my family, how are you doing, is everything okay, always caring for me. And so I'm really very grateful for this paternal way, and I think that is the most important experience that I will bring with me forever, in particular of that challenging and fascinating period I was the Vatican spokesman.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Andreas.